Hey guys, so I'm wanting to do a few short videos about the transition between the opening and the middle game, because this has cropped up a few times. It's been mentioned on chess.com forums. People have been asking about what do you do when you've completed when the opening section is finished, maybe you've completed your development, and not knowing how to proceed from there. I think for a lot of beginners who might learn a particular setup like the London system, for example, which is very sound. As soon as you've arranged your pieces in the appropriate form, it's like, well, now what? Now what do I do? So I want to work through some games. I'm just going to start with one that I played this morning. It's a 30-minute rapid game, and I've got the white pieces. I start with e4, e5, knight to f3, knight to c6, and now I play the Scotch with d4, and e takes d4, and now the Scotch gambit with bishop to c4. So I don't capture the pawn straight away. Pawn is played, which has the advantage of releasing the light squared bishop, but the disadvantage of blocking in the dark squared bishop, and I castle. So you can castle at various points during the opening. Obviously, you need to have moved at least the knight and the bishop on one side. And if you're castling long, the queen has to move as well, obviously. So sometimes it makes sense to castle early on in your development. So this is move 5 for white. And I think generally it's a good idea, particularly if you know what your structure is going to be and you know which side of the board you would typically castle on. Other times I might wait and hang on because I want to know which way my opponent's going to castle before I commit. Okay, but in this case, castling early, move 5, seemed to make sense. It also allows me maybe to release, bring this rook into the game, moving it over to the e file sometime soon. And now h6 is played to stop any ideas of either the knight or the dark squared bishop going to g5. That's kind of a prophylactic move, this one, but it's kind of defensive. However, it does nothing to progress black's opening. Right, so now I recapture the pawn, because if knight recaptures, I have queen captures, and I'm ahead in development there. Okay, so black doesn't capture, which makes sense, and instead brings out his knight to f6. However, I now notice that there's a tactic here. So during the opening part of the game, you should always have your antennae feeling for opportunities to gain a positional advantage or a material advantage. And here I figure that initiating the exchange of knights, although my knight has already moved a couple of times, it's going to leave black with 3 pawn islands, right? So we've got doubled pawns on the c file, we've got an isolated pawn on the a file. So I figure that gives, yes, I'm giving up a developed piece, but I feel like, especially seeing as black hasn't yet castled, that it's maybe a kind of positional advantage in the game and worth using up that move. It's not like I'm losing a tempo doing that, because black also has to respond and make the pawn capture. So as things stand, we're kind of equal, and black's got 3 pawns off the starting blocks, but the significant thing here is that white has castled. So now it's time to go back to development. Okay. Without any further ado, knight to c3, defends his pawn from the knight and any other attackers coming. Now black develops the bishop. Remember that we mentioned that with d6 it made life difficult for this bishop, so now the bishop has only been able to come to e7 to allow the king to castle. However, the downside of that move as well is that the queen is now blocked in. So you can see how the opening moves, even though they might seem quite innocuous and not terribly important or relevant, they are very, very important, because they guide or constrain or make possible different things later on. So it is very, very important to be able to get your pieces out to develop into the board. And black's struggling a little here, but he's going to be able to castle. So, and now I bring out my dark squared bishop. So I'm trying to clear my back rank. I want to get my queen off there, so that my rooks are connected. Maybe centralize my rooks. I've got a semi-open D file here, a semi-open E file of mine, and then think about an attack. Okay, so now black castles. I move my queen to f3 because there's no knight on there, and it's time now to think about constructing some kind of assault against black's kingside. Black, I don't know what, I mean, this is just simply a blunder. Black tries to move the knight across, but the knight's in an undefended position, so I just grab it with the queen. And now bishop to f6. It is defending the g7 pawn, because there might be ideas at some point of putting either a queen or a rook on here, and then this would be the tactic of capturing a piece whose defender is pinned. Because if there was a queen or a rook on there, this pawn is pinned against the king, and so I can capture this pawn for free because its defender is not a defender if it's pinned. So now I start to push into black's position. So let's just take stock at this point in time, right? This is the point, really, because on 2 moves ago, right, white has now completed development. Black hasn't quite completed development. The queen is not going to get off the back rank in a hurry, but this bishop does have a lot of scope on the board. The dark squared bishop is poor. Okay, so now let's say you're white in this position. What do you want to be thinking about doing? Well, you can't win a game of chess by just defending, really. So you need to have some kind of idea about how you're going to take the game to your opponent. And any idea is better than no idea at all. Even if it's a bad one, it's worth a try. Okay, so here, ideas could include, for example, queen to g3, because it comes with a threat, and the threat means that your opponent's going to have to respond. And that means that your opponent may end up making moves that they wouldn't normally intend to make because they might be weakening moves, right? So this is one really important reason why you should complete your development as quickly as possible. So this is now move 10. The quickest that you can complete development is 8 moves, but we've used a couple of moves to do other things, like exchanging the knights on here to double up the pawns. Okay, so now I've got all my remaining minor pieces are out in the board. My queen is out in the board. My rooks are connected. My king is safe. Okay, white has now completed development. Black is a couple of moves behind. And so this is the point that we're talking about. This is the point where you say, okay, development's over. Now I need to come up with a plan. So things that I would be thinking about, particularly, I think the placement of the minor pieces, I think, is key. So generally, you'll want your bishops to be looking towards the opponent's king. Okay, so my light square bishop there is doing a good job. It might even drop back to b3 at some point, and it's on the same diagonal as my opponent's king. That's really good. My dark square bishop, on the other hand, is kind of on the wrong side of the board for looking at the king, because it's looking on these diagonals. So this one over to the queen side is pretty pointless. This one over to the king side here, as we've said, could have some tactical ideas to it. Okay. How about this knight? Well, this knight could be in a defensive role. I mean, right now it's defending this pawn along with the queen from black's knight, but black's knight is also in a defensive role as well. Having said that, it's lost its h7 pawn because that pawn has advanced early on. Let's see if that becomes relevant later on. So I might think, for example, about bringing my knight around. Okay, one of the big differences that I notice between beginners and more experienced players is that beginners will tend to launch a bit of an attack, but without enough forces behind it. So one of the really important things is to coordinate all your pieces. If you want to attack your enemy's position, you're going to need normally 3 pieces to be involved in the assault at least, but the more the merrier. Okay, so this knight is a long way from my opponent's king, so it cannot at this point be involved in any kind of attacking ideas. So maybe one thought might be, let's improve the knight, let's bring it round here. You know, and I might even plan something like that out at this point, knowing that I've actually got a couple of moves in hand because my opponent is a little bit behind. So knight comes to there, blunder, knight is lost. Bishop comes out, and now e5. So, I mean, this pawn here on that square, it didn't have an awful lot to do. So I figure let's use it. Let's, you know, send it in as a cannon fodder and just try and break up the position a little bit in the middle. Pawn takes, because I also notice as well, of course, it's got 2 attackers, and it's also got 2 defenders with my queen on this square now, because my queen captured the knight. So it doesn't actually make sense for black to capture. Black doesn't win anything by capturing. And now the bishops are facing off. And now I'm just looking for opportunities to push my opponent, to make my opponent respond and maybe get into a worse situation. So rook a to d1 attacks the queen. Queen has to move on to the e file really. And now f4. So a pawn break. And I'm attacking clearly the dark squared bishop. I'm also maybe opening up ideas to lift my rook and bring it across to the g file in line with black's king. Right, so let's say this bishop runs away. That's probably not the best square. Yeah, but at some point, if the rook gets to there, we could even then capture this pawn, assuming this bishop's out the way. And again, like you say, so you're just kind of thinking about setting up the potential for future attacks. You don't have to go all out immediately. Okay, so black plays g6, kicking my queen, which is a counter-attack. So I'm attacking black's bishop. So black attacks my queen, which is a more valuable piece. So it doesn't make sense for me to capture the bishop, but that's fine. I'll just move the queen out of the way. And this move, again, has somewhat weakened black's space around his king. Now the bishop drops back. Now when you are down in material, it generally doesn't make sense to invite trades, but I gladly accept the bishop. I'm a full knight in front now. Now I would really like to move my knight into the game, but at the same time I don't want to lose the pawn on b2. But it's tricky to know how to protect that pawn. I guess the knight could maybe move round and protect it, and then the pawn move forward, something like that. But in the end, I think I end up actually protecting it with a rook, because I want this knight to do more. So now I slightly improve the position of my bishop, I think, putting it on c2 where it's defended by this pawn, and we're now putting our sights on this g6 square. And now h5, again, another pawn push, probably not very advisable. Now I bring my rook across just to protect the pawn so that I can release my knight. I bring my knight in and attack the queen. Now this does undefend a2, but it comes with a more serious attack. Queen moves, and now I hit the queen again with g3. The big difference is that I've got my queen here, so my kingside is actually, it feels a lot more secure, I think, than black's, whose queen is on the outside of all of that. So the queen has to move again, and all of these moves that black is having to make are moves where black is not progressing his own ideas of an attack. So there's no attack here yet. Okay, so I just push b3. Black only has a light squared bishop, so putting my pawns here on light squares reduces the options for the bishop and kind of closes it in. Queen comes in. So I'm not really sure what this queen is doing. I mean, I guess one idea could have been to go there, but then why didn't black move there immediately if they want to attack that pawn, which is undefended? But this is kind of an example of just moving pieces around without much of an idea of a clear plan, because look, this rook on a8 hasn't entered the game yet. This rook really wants to be on one of these semi-open or open files. There's two completely open files in the D and E here, and that's where those rooks want to be. It's a matter of improving the placement of your pieces in order to create the possibility of an attack, which creates the possibility of a win. But this queen move I don't really understand. It's not really attacking anything. And now my knight can come in with check, another forcing move. And now I sacrifice the knight by capturing on h5. So I figured that if pawn takes and queen takes, which is what happens, so I've gotten 2 pawns in return for a knight. So I've given up roughly 1 pawn's worth of material. However, it now means that this king is very exposed in this corner of the board. And look, I've got a very nice bishop here that I previously moved from c4 down to d3, and there's a serious threat of a queen coming in. So rook comes across, queen to g5 check, king has to go onto the back rank really, and now again another pawn push, f5. So you don't want to make pawn pushes. You don't want to undefend squares and maybe break up your structure unless there's a good reason to do so, and I think this is a good reason. We are now targeting the f7 square, and so I want to get this bishop away. This bishop is actually almost trapped as well. Not quite, but okay. So black now responds to the attack on the bishop with another counter-attack with check, and I simply block that one. I think that moving the king either to here or here would simply invite the bishop to come in with an attack, and king can't go to there, so that could be difficult, but I figured that this was actually a much safer option. It also then creates the possibility of me doubling my rooks on the f-file, which is no bad thing. So I block, and the bishop moves away out of the attack, but look at this. Pawn to c4 actually traps the bishop. It looked as though this bishop was coming to a better square, but the bishop now can't go there because of the rook, can't go to either of those because of the king, and can't go there because of my pawn. So the bishop is technically trapped now. Rook comes across with another counter-attack, but I respond with check. Black has to get out of check. Now this is an in-between move. All right, I don't have to capture the bishop immediately, because if you can make a move with check, your opponent has to respond to the check, and clearly can't respond by moving the bishop, blocking with the bishop. It'll just lose the bishop anyway. So the king moves, and now I capture the bishop. So now I'm 2 minor pieces in front. Pawn recaptures, and I move my king off of this diagonal so that my rook on f2 is able to move. I think a clear idea for the rook would be to come across to e2 and join in the party that way. Queen comes down with a half-hearted attack on the bishop. The bishop moves again with check. King's starting to run out of spaces, and now this is a lovely move. Nice tactic. So the pawn is attacking the bishop, but I noticed that with knight here, hits the queen has to move off, away from the defense of the pawn, has to move off the c-file, otherwise it'll just be captured next move. And when the queen moves off the c-file, I've then got 3 attackers on that pawn, and maximum 2 defenders, even if the queen manages to find a square where it can defend the pawn, and I don't think it even can. So let's see where the queen ends up. Okay, queen goes to there. I come in with check, and another check. And you can see that having the initiative, you can see how I've carried forward the initiative right from the opening, really, and having completed my development a bit quicker has led to me having the upper hand in the middle game, and now we're getting towards the ending. So I figure I'm up in material, I'm up a couple of pawns, and I have a bishop. So moving my queen to here is a fork, and it's forcing really black to go into an exchange of queens, because it comes with check. If the king moves, I simply take the queen, so there's no other option. So we're simplifying the game. Another f pawn push, another check. Now I move my rook across, so threatening more, and you can see how lifting the rooks off, the black hasn't had the opportunity to do this yet. And the game finishes pretty quickly. Another check, and now I can do a discovered attack, or so I could have done a discovered check there, forcing the king. In fact, that might even be checkmate. No, because the king could have gone here. Yeah. So maybe actually, if rook across there, no, because then the king could have got the... Yeah, so there isn't a checkmate there. If I'd have moved the rook back with check from the bishop, king could have gone forwards. Yeah. So instead of that, check here. This is more forcing. Now, in this position, the king has to go to h6, because that then protects against rook to h5. But the king actually moves to h7, and relatively simple checkmate there in the end. So I hope this has been handy to give a few just general principles of how to manage that transition from the opening into the middle game. So general ideas: you want to be improving the position of your pieces once you've got your king safe and all your minor pieces are out on the board. So you want to think about the position of your knights and your bishops. Bishops can hold back, but generally want to be on the opposite side of the opposite corner from where your opponent's king is going to be. Knights, if they're going to be part of an attack, then want to be moving forwards towards the king's position. You want to be thinking about bringing your rooks together, and also considering pawn breaks, because pawn breaks will change the format of the board. And also, as you've seen in this one, with the f-pawn getting all the way up to the 6th rank on here, can be useful for opening up space for rooks as well. So have a plan, even if it's not a good one, but have some kind of plan that will put some pressure on your opponent. And it's about kind of building up those layers of pressure, building up the potential and the possibility of attacks in the future. You don't just want to sit back and wait for your opponent to start attacking you, because that's not a very good way, not a very effective way to win a game of chess. So have some kind of idea of how you're going to pressurize your opponent, if not launch an all-out assault, but build up your pieces, improve your position until you can find the opportunity that you think you're going to get a serious, significant material advantage in the game. Okay, so this will be the first of a series on middle game ideas. Hope it's been useful for you. If you haven't subscribed yet to Chess Bootcamp, please do subscribe. I'll see you soon.